The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Pine Valley's most exclusive neighborhood as Officer Ann Parker guided her patrol car down Maple Street. Her fingers drummed against the steering wheel while her eyes scanned the pristine lawns and million-dollar homes. She'd been working this beat for 3 years now, and she prided herself on knowing every face, every car, and every routine in what she considered her territory. That's why the woman in the gray running outfit caught her attention immediately. The stranger moved with purpose, stopping occasionally to check her phone while walking along the sidewalk. Anne's eyes narrowed as she slowed her patrol car. Something about this woman didn't fit the usual pattern of the neighborhood. Not in Anne's mind, anyway. The woman was dressed in high-end workout gear, the kind you'd find at expensive boutiques, and wore her natural hair pulled back in a neat bun. She could have been any other resident out for an evening walk, but Anne had already made up her mind. Years of ingrained prejudices and assumptions clouded her judgment as she pulled her cruiser to the curb. "Excuse me, ma'am," Anne called out, stepping from her vehicle. Her hand instinctively rested on her belt as she approached. "We've had some reports of suspicious activity in the area. Mind if I ask what you're doing here?" The woman in question was Dr. Rose Thompson, though Anne wouldn't learn this until later. Fresh from a 12-hour shift saving lives at Metropolitan General, Rose had simply wanted to enjoy some fresh air before heading home, to her own house, just 3 doors down. "I live here," Rose replied calmly, already reaching for her phone to pull up proof of residence. But Annie wasn't interested in proof. She'd seen too many suspicious persons in her time, or so she told herself. Each small movement Rose made seemed to amplify Anne's unfounded suspicions. "Up against the car, please," Anne demanded, her voice taking on that hard edge she reserved for people she'd already decided were guilty. "Hands where I can see them." Neighbors began appearing on their porches, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Chen from across the street stood frozen, watering can in hand, as she watched the scene unfold. Mr. Peterson paused while walking his golden retriever, his mouth falling open in shock as he recognized Rose, the same doctor who regularly volunteered at the community health clinic. Rose maintained her composure, even as Anne roughly secured the handcuffs around her wrists. "Officer, if you just let me explain," she started, her voice steady despite the humiliation of being arrested in front of her own home. "You can explain down at the station." Anne cut her off, already reciting the Miranda rights with mechanical efficiency. She couldn't see past her own preconceptions to notice the quality of Rose's running shoes, or the hospital ID card partially visible in her phone case, or the house keys dangling from a lanyard bearing the hospital's logo. As Anne maneuvered Rose into the back of the patrol car, more neighbors emerged. Some began recording with their phones, others called the police station directly. The evening air grew thick with tension and disbelief. None of them could understand why their beloved neighbor, the brilliant doctor who had touched so many lives in their community, was being treated like a criminal. Little did Anne know that this arrest would become a turning point not just in her career, but in her entire life. The next few hours would shatter every preconception she held, forcing her to confront the ugly truth about her own prejudices. But for now, she sat in the driver's seat, convinced she was just doing her job, blind to the fact that she was about to learn one of life's most powerful lessons. The ride to the police station was tense and silent. Every few minutes, Officer Ann Parker would glance in her rearview mirror at the woman sitting in the back seat. Dr. Rose Thompson sat perfectly still, her head held high despite the handcuffs biting into her wrists. She'd been through similar situations before, not arrests, but moments where people judged her based on nothing but her appearance. Years of experience had taught her that maintaining dignity was sometimes the strongest form of resistance. "This is completely unnecessary," Rose finally said, her voice calm but firm. "I have ID, proof of residence, and several neighbors who can verify who I am." She watched Anne's shoulders stiffen, but noticed the officer didn't respond. Anne was too busy fighting the small voice in the back of her head that wondered if she'd made a mistake. But she pushed that doubt away, just like she always did. As they pulled into the station's parking lot, a small crowd had already gathered. News traveled fast in Pine Valley, especially when it involved one of the community's most respected members. Several neighbors had called ahead, their voices filled with outrage and disbelief. But Anne didn't know about those calls yet. She was still operating under her own misguided assumptions as she led Rose through the station doors. The fluorescent lights inside the station cast harsh shadows across both women's faces. The usual evening buzz of activity stopped as heads turned to watch them pass. Officer Chen, working the front desk, did a double take. He had just gotten off the phone with Mrs. Chen, his mother, who had witnessed the arrest and given him an earful about the respected doctor who lived down their street. "Officer Parker," he called out, rising from his chair. "I think there's been a—" But Anne cut him off with a sharp look, leading Rose toward the processing area. She was determined to prove she'd made the right call, even as doubt began creeping in around the edges of her certainty. Rose noticed the changing expressions on the faces of other officers as they passed. Recognition flickered in their eyes, followed by confusion and then concern. She had treated many of their family members at the hospital, volunteered at their community events, and spoken at their children's career days. But she remained silent, knowing that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from letting people face the consequences of their actions. The processing room was small and stark, with its metal desk and uncomfortable plastic chairs. Anne began the booking procedure, her movements mechanical as she took Rose's fingerprints. The doctor complied quietly, maintaining eye contact with each person who entered the room, and there were many. Word was spreading through the station like wildfire. "Name?" Anne asked, trying to keep her voice professional despite the growing knot in her stomach. "Dr. Rose Thompson, Chief of Neurosurgery at Metropolitan General Hospital," Rose replied clearly. She watched as Anne's fingers froze over the keyboard. "The same Dr. Thompson who removed Officer Wilson's daughter's brain tumor last month. The same Dr. Thompson who volunteers at the free clinic every Wednesday. The same Dr. Thompson who lives at 1242 Maple Street, exactly where you arrested me." The door burst open before Anne could respond. Captain Richards stood in the doorway, his face a storm cloud of anger and disbelief. "Parker. In my office now." His voice boomed through the small room. "And somebody get these handcuffs off Dr. Thompson immediately." As another officer rushed to remove the cuffs, Anne stood frozen, the full weight of her mistake finally crashing down around her. She watched as several officers approached Rose with profuse apologies, offering her water, a phone, anything she needed. The doctor rubbed her wrists gently where the handcuffs had been, but her expression wasn't one of anger. It was something more complex, a mixture of sadness and determination. Anne felt her world tilting on its axis as she followed the captain to his office. She had been so sure, so convinced of her own judgment. Now, standing in the harsh light of truth, she began to see how her prejudices had painted an entirely false picture, one that would have serious consequences for everyone involved. The captain's office felt smaller than ever as Anne stood before his desk, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. The setting sun through the blinds cast prison bar shadows across the floor, a fitting image for how trapped she felt in this moment. Captain Richards sat heavily in his chair, running a hand over his face before fixing Anne with a look that made her want to disappear into the floor. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked, his voice unnaturally quiet. "That woman in there, Dr. Thompson, she saved my Katie's life 6 months ago. 12 hours of brain surgery, and she didn't leave the operating room once. She stayed with us during recovery, explained everything in a way we could understand, gave us her personal number in case we had concerns." He paused, letting the words sink in. "And you just arrested her for walking in her own neighborhood." Anne felt her throat tighten. She'd been at the hospital that day, part of the support team when Katie was rushed in after her accident. She'd even seen Dr. Thompson in her scrubs, focused and professional, heading to surgery. The memory crashed into her consciousness like a physical blow. How had she not recognized her? Outside the office, through the glass walls, she could see Dr. Thompson sitting in the break room, surrounded by apologetic officers. Officer Chen's mother had arrived with a thermos of hot tea and was fussing over the doctor like a concerned parent. The community relations officer was already on the phone, trying to get ahead of the story that was spreading through social media like wildfire. "I've got the mayor calling me," Captain Richards continued, holding up his phone. "The hospital board is furious. Do you understand the position you've put this department in? The damage you've done to our community relations?" He shook his head. "But forget about all that for a moment. I want you to explain to me, in your own words, why you arrested her." Anne opened her mouth, then closed it again. Every explanation she'd been so sure of earlier now sounded hollow and shameful in her mind. How could she admit that she'd seen nothing but skin color and made assumptions that had no basis in reality? "I thought," she started, but her voice cracked. "I assumed." "That's right," the captain cut in. "You assumed, and those assumptions could cost you your badge." He leaned forward, placing both hands on his desk. "You're suspended, effective immediately, pending investigation. But more than that, you're going to have to take a long, hard look at yourself and the prejudices that led to this moment." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Dr. Thompson herself, standing tall and dignified despite everything that had happened. "Captain," she said, "may I have a word?" The captain immediately stood, gesturing for her to enter. "Dr. Thompson, I cannot apologize enough for what happened today. We're taking immediate action." But Rose held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Actually, I'd like to suggest an alternative approach." She turned to look directly at Anne, who could barely meet her gaze. "Instead of just suspension, I think Officer Parker and I need to have a real conversation. About assumptions, about experiences, and about how we can turn this incident into something meaningful for our community." Both Anne and the captain stared at her in surprise. After everything that had happened, after the humiliation and injustice she'd faced, Dr. Thompson was offering an opportunity for dialogue instead of demanding punishment. "I've seen too many situations like this end in nothing but anger and divided communities," Rose continued. "Maybe this time we can write a different ending. That is," she looked at Anne again, "if Officer Parker is willing to listen and learn." Anne felt tears welling up in her eyes, a mixture of shame and unexpected hope. "I am," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I want to understand. I need to understand." The captain looked between the two women, amazement clear on his face. The sun had fully set now, and the office was dim except for the desk lamp. In that soft light, something powerful was taking shape, the beginning of a transformation that would reach far beyond just these two people in this small office on this life-changing evening. The next morning came with the weight of consequences. Anne sat at her kitchen table, staring at her phone as news notifications kept popping up. Local headlines read, "Respected doctor wrongfully arrested," and "Police officer suspended after racial profiling incident." Each ping felt like another small blow to her chest. Her coffee had gone cold, untouched, when her doorbell rang. Standing on her porch was Officer Chen, looking uncomfortable but determined. "The department psychologist wants to see you at 2 p.m., he said quietly. "And there's a mandatory bias training session scheduled for next week." He hesitated before adding, "My mom asked about you. She said Dr. Thompson was at the community center this morning, talking to people, trying to calm things down." Anne felt a fresh wave of shame wash over her. Even now, Dr. Thompson was working to prevent the situation from dividing the community further. Meanwhile, Anne had barely slept, replaying every moment of yesterday in her mind, seeing all the signs she'd chosen to ignore. The bias training session turned out to be just the beginning. Anne sat in the back of the room, aware of the sideways glances from her fellow officers. The instructor, a diversity consultant from the State Police Academy, clicked through slides about unconscious bias and systemic racism. But Annie barely heard the words. She was too busy thinking about her upcoming meeting with Dr. Thompson. They had agreed to meet at a small coffee shop downtown, neutral territory away from both the hospital and the police station. Anne arrived early, her hands shaking slightly as she ordered a simple black coffee. When Dr. Thompson walked in, several patrons recognized her. Anne watched as they smiled and waved, seeing firsthand the respect this woman commanded in their community. "Thank you for coming," Rose said as she sat down, placing her own cup of tea on the table. Her voice was gentle but firm. "I think it's important we talk about what happened, but more importantly, about what happens next." Anne nodded, struggling to find words. "I've been suspended for 2 weeks," she finally managed. "There's an investigation, training sessions. But it all feels so inadequate compared to what I did to you." Rose studied her for a moment before speaking. "You know, yesterday wasn't the first time something like this has happened to me." She paused, letting that sink in. "The first time was when I was in medical school. Then again during my residency. Once while I was wearing scrubs, walking to perform emergency surgery." She traced the rim of her cup with one finger. "Each time, people made assumptions about where I belonged." Anne felt her chest tighten as she listened. She'd never thought about how many times Dr. Thompson might have faced similar situations, how exhausting it must be to constantly prove you belong in your own spaces. "But here's what makes yesterday different," Rose continued. "You're willing to sit here now, to listen and learn. That's rare. Most people double down on their assumptions, make excuses, or just walk away. The fact that you're here tells me something important about who you might become." A few tables away, someone was taking pictures with their phone. Anne knew this would probably end up on social media too. The suspended officer and the wrongfully arrested doctor having coffee together. But somehow that didn't matter anymore. "I want to understand," Anne said, her voice cracking slightly. "I want to learn how to be better, how to see past my own prejudices. But I don't even know where to start." Rose reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. "I have some ideas about that. The hospital where I work has a community outreach program. We work with local schools, community centers, and yes, law enforcement. Instead of just sitting through training sessions, how would you feel about getting involved? Really involved?" For the first time since yesterday, Anne felt a small spark of hope. This wasn't just about saving her job anymore. It was about becoming someone different, someone better. As they began to discuss specific plans and possibilities, neither woman noticed that the coffee shop had grown quieter, with other patrons watching this unexpected scene of reconciliation and growth unfold before them. The community center buzzed with activity as Anne walked through its doors 1 month after the incident. She traded her police uniform for casual clothes, but some of the teenagers still eyed her warily. They knew who she was. News of the arrest had spread everywhere in their small city. But that's exactly why she was here. "Over here," called Mrs. Chen, waving from a table where she was setting up refreshments. The weekly youth mentoring program was about to start, and today was Anne's first time as a volunteer. Dr. Thompson had suggested this as part of Anne's journey to understand and connect with the community she had sworn to protect. "I'm nervous," Anne admitted quietly to Mrs. Chen while arranging cookies on a plate. "What if they don't want me here?" Mrs. Chen patted her arm. "That's exactly why you need to be here. Change doesn't happen from a distance." The room gradually filled with high school students, dropping their backpacks and grabbing snacks. Some came straight from basketball practice, others from study groups. Anne noticed how they naturally separated themselves at first, the Asian students at one table, Black students at another, Hispanic students grouping together near the window. Dr. Thompson arrived a few minutes later, carrying a stack of medical textbooks. This wasn't her usual evening for volunteering, but she'd come specifically to help introduce Anne to the group. The students immediately perked up at her arrival. Many knew her from her regular visits to their schools, where she spoke about careers in medicine. Today, Rose announced to the group, "We're going to talk about assumptions and how they can shape our lives, both negatively and positively." She gestured for Anne to join her at the front of the room. "Officer Parker has agreed to share her story with us." Anne's heart pounded as she faced the young faces. Some looked curious, others skeptical. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "A month ago, I made a terrible mistake," she started, her voice shaky but growing stronger. "I let my prejudices affect my judgment, and I hurt someone who has done nothing but help our community. I'm here because I want to share what I've learned since then." As Anne spoke honestly about her biases and her journey to confront them, she noticed the students starting to lean in. One girl raised her hand. "Something like that happened to my dad," she said quietly. "He was just fixing his own car in our driveway, but someone called the police because they thought he was stealing it." Other stories began to pour out. A boy talked about being followed around stores. Another student shared how teachers always seemed surprised when he got good grades. As they talked, Anne noticed something remarkable. The invisible barriers between the different groups began to dissolve as they recognized shared experiences. Dr. Thompson guided the discussion skillfully, helping students express their feelings while keeping the conversation constructive. "But here's what I want you all to understand," she said, looking around the room. "While it's important to acknowledge these problems, it's even more important to know that change is possible." She turned to Anne. Officer Parker could have gotten defensive. She could have denied her mistakes or tried to justify them. Instead, she chose to learn and grow. That's the kind of courage we need to build bridges in our community. The session evolved into a brainstorming meeting, with students suggesting ways to improve understanding between law enforcement and young people in their community. One student proposed a regular basketball game between police officers and teenagers. Another suggested having officers volunteer as tutors. As the evening wound down, a quiet boy who hadn't spoken much approached Anne. "My little brother wants to be a police officer," he said, "but our mom is scared for him. Do you think things will be different by the time he grows up?" Anne looked at the hope in his eyes and felt the weight of responsibility in her answer. "I can't promise everything will be perfect," she said honestly. "But I can promise that there are people working to make things better. And if your brother becomes an officer, he'll have the chance to be part of that change." Later, helping to clean up, Anne found herself standing next to Dr. Thompson. "Thank you," she said simply, "for showing me that it's not enough to just feel bad about our prejudices. We have to actively work to change them." Rose smiled, handing her a stack of chairs to fold. "This is just the beginning," she said. "Real change happens one conversation, one person, one day at a time." The community center buzzed with activity as Anne walked through its doors 1 month after the incident. She traded her police uniform for casual clothes, but some of the teenagers still eyed her warily. They knew who she was. News of the arrest had spread everywhere in their small city, but that's exactly why she was here. "Over here," called Mrs. Chen, waving from a table where she was setting up refreshments. The weekly youth mentoring program was about to start, and today was Anne's first time as a volunteer. Dr. Thompson had suggested this as part of Anne's journey to understand and connect with the community she had sworn to protect. "I'm nervous," Anne admitted quietly to Mrs. Chen while arranging cookies on a plate. "What if they don't want me here?" Mrs. Chen patted her arm. "That's exactly why you need to be here. Change doesn't happen from a distance." The room gradually filled with high school students, dropping their backpacks and grabbing snacks. Some came straight from basketball practice, others from study groups. Anne noticed how they naturally separated themselves at first, the Asian students at one table, Black students at another, Hispanic students grouping together near the window. Dr. Thompson arrived a few minutes later, carrying a stack of medical textbooks. This wasn't her usual evening for volunteering, but she'd come specifically to help introduce Anne to the group. The students immediately perked up at her arrival. Many knew her from her regular visits to their schools, where she spoke about careers in medicine. Today, Rose announced to the group, "We're going to talk about assumptions and how they can shape our lives, both negatively and positively." She gestured for Anne to join her at the front of the room. "Officer Parker has agreed to share her story with us." Anne's heart pounded as she faced the young faces. Some looked curious, others skeptical. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. "A month ago, I made a terrible mistake," she started, her voice shaky but growing stronger. "I let my prejudices affect my judgment, and I hurt someone who has done nothing but help our community. I'm here because I want to share what I've learned since then." As Anne spoke honestly about her biases and her journey to confront them, she noticed the students starting to lean in. One girl raised her hand. "Something like that happened to my dad," she said quietly. "He was just fixing his own car in our driveway, but someone called the police because they thought he was stealing it." Other stories began to pour out. A boy talked about being followed around stores. Another student shared how teachers always seemed surprised when he got good grades. As they talked, Anne noticed something remarkable. The invisible barriers between the different groups began to dissolve as they recognized shared experiences. Dr. Thompson guided the discussion skillfully, helping students express their feelings while keeping the conversation constructive. "But here's what I want you all to understand," she said, looking around the room. "While it's important to acknowledge these problems, it's even more important to know that change is possible." She turned to Anne. Officer Parker could have gotten defensive. She could have denied her mistakes or tried to justify them. Instead, she chose to learn and grow. That's the kind of courage we need to build bridges in our community. The session evolved into a brainstorming meeting, with students suggesting ways to improve understanding between law enforcement and young people in their community. One student proposed a regular basketball game between police officers and teenagers. Another suggested having officers volunteer as tutors. As the evening wound down, a quiet boy who hadn't spoken much approached Anne. "My little brother wants to be a police officer," he said. "But our mom is scared for him. Do you think things will be different by the time he grows up?" Anne looked at the hope in his eyes and felt the weight of responsibility in her answer. "I can't promise everything will be perfect," she said honestly. "But I can promise that there are people working to make things better. And if your brother becomes an officer, he'll have the chance to be part of that change." Later, helping to clean up, Anne found herself standing next to Dr. Thompson. "Thank you," she said simply, "for showing me that it's not enough to just feel bad about our prejudices. We have to actively work to change them." Rose smiled, handing her a stack of chairs to fold. "This is just the beginning," she said. "Real change happens one conversation, one person, one day at a time." The police station's training room looked different somehow as Anne prepared for her first presentation. 3 months had passed since the incident, and she'd returned to active duty 2 weeks ago. But today wasn't about patrol duties, it was about sharing what she'd learned. The room filled quickly with officers from her precinct and neighboring districts. She spotted Officer Chen, giving her an encouraging thumbs up from the back row. Captain Richards sat in the front, his presence both supportive and evaluative. But what made Anne's heart skip was seeing Dr. Thompson slip quietly into the room, taking a seat near the door. "I never thought I'd be standing here like this," Anne began, her voice steady despite her nerves. 3 months ago, I made a mistake that could have ended my career. Instead, it became the wake-up call that changed my life." She clicked to the first slide, a photo of herself and Dr. Thompson at the community center, surrounded by teenagers from their mentoring program. "This isn't going to be your typical bias training session. I'm not here to quote statistics or show you charts. I'm here to share a real story about real people. As Anne spoke about her journey, she noticed how her fellow officers reacted. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, perhaps seeing themselves in her story. Others nodded in recognition of situations they'd witnessed or experienced themselves. We talk a lot about split-second decisions in our line of work, she continued. But what we don't talk about enough is how our pre-existing beliefs influence those decisions. That day, I wasn't really seeing Dr. Thompson. I was seeing all my unconscious biases walking down the street. She shared specific examples from her time shadowing Dr. Thompson at the hospital. The small daily indignities, the constant need to prove credentials, the way some patients would relax only after confirming her qualifications multiple times. But here's what really opened my eyes, Anne said, clicking to a new slide showing the community center's youth program. I started to see how our assumptions affect the next generation. When we act on our biases, we're not just hurting one person. We're reinforcing barriers that these kids will have to face. One of the newer officers raised his hand. But what about officer safety? We can't second-guess every decision in the field. It was the question Anne had been expecting. Dr. Thompson leaned forward slightly, watching how she would handle it. Good question, Anne responded. Officer safety is crucial. But our biases don't actually make us safer. They can cloud our judgment and make us miss real threats while creating problems where none exist. I was never in any danger from Dr. Thompson. My bias created a situation that put everyone at risk, including myself. She clicked to another slide, showing statistics about community trust and police effectiveness. When we build real relationships with our community, when we learn to see people as individuals rather than stereotypes, we actually become better at our jobs. We get more cooperation, better information, and stronger community support. The presentation shifted to practical strategies, things she'd learned both from her own experience and from working with Dr. Thompson. How to check your initial reactions, how to approach situations with clarity instead of assumptions, how to build genuine connections with community members. This isn't about being perfect, Anne emphasized, noticing some officers starting to look overwhelmed. It's about being willing to learn and grow. 3 months ago, I thought my career was over. Instead, I found a new purpose in it. As she concluded, the room fell silent for a moment before Captain Richards started the applause. Officers began approaching her, some sharing their own experiences, others asking about the community programs she'd mentioned. Dr. Thompson made her way to the front of the room, a warm smile on her face. You know, she said quietly to Anne, when I suggested you turn this experience into a teaching opportunity, I never imagined it would grow into something this impactful. Anne watched her fellow officers mingling, discussing the presentation with new energy. It's like you told me at the community center, real change happens one conversation at a time. I'm just trying to start those conversations. Looking around the room, Anne could see small seeds of change taking root. Officers were talking openly about experiences they'd never shared before, discussing situations they might have handled differently, considering new approaches to community engagement. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a beginning. And sometimes beginnings are the most powerful part of any change. 6 months had passed since the incident, and the local newspaper wanted to do a follow-up story. Anne sat in the hospital cafeteria with Dr. Thompson, both of them looking at the reporter's questions with mixed feelings. The young journalist sat across from them, recorder ready, eager to capture what had become an unexpected story of transformation and community change. To be honest, Anne began, stirring her coffee, I was against doing this interview at first. I worried people would think we were trying to make something positive out of a terrible situation. She glanced at Rose, who nodded encouragingly. But that's exactly what happened, Rose added, her voice carrying the warmth that had become familiar to Anne over the past months. Not because we wanted to sugarcoat anything, but because both of us chose to do the hard work of creating real change. The reporter leaned forward. Can you tell me about some of the changes you've seen? Anne and Rose shared a look, remembering the past 6 months. The weekly youth mentoring program had grown from a dozen kids to over 50. The police department had implemented new training protocols based on Anne's experiences. Community complaints about racial profiling had decreased significantly. Last week, Anne said, "I responded to a call about a suspicious person in Pine Valley. It turned out to be a young black man who was a new resident just moving in. Instead of approaching with suspicion, I introduced myself and offered to help him carry his boxes." She paused, remembering how the neighbor who had called looked embarrassed when she realized her own bias. "That's the kind of small but significant change we're seeing," Rose explained. "It's not just about avoiding negative interactions. It's about creating positive ones." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Ashley, the young girl from the Career Shadow program. Now a regular at the hospital's youth science program, she carried a report card full of A's in her science classes. Her face lit up when she saw them. "Dr. Thompson, Officer Parker. Look." She proudly showed them her grades. "I got into the summer medical program you told me about." The reporter watched as both women celebrated with Ashley, noting how natural their interaction was. This wasn't just a story about overcoming prejudice. It was about building new connections that crossed traditional boundaries. "You know what really changed?" Anne said after Ashley left. "It's not just about being less biased. It's about actively working to create opportunities. Every time I'm on patrol now, I think about how I can build bridges instead of walls." Rose nodded. "In the medical field, we talk about treating the cause, not just the symptoms. That's what we're trying to do here. Address the root causes of prejudice through education, interaction, and understanding." The reporter asked about challenges they still faced. Neither woman sugarcoated the reality. "Of course there are still problems," Rose acknowledged. "Change doesn't happen overnight. But what's different now is how we address these issues. We have open discussions instead of avoiding uncomfortable topics." Anne added, "Last month, one of our newer officers made a mistake similar to mine. Instead of just disciplining him, we brought him into our community program. He's now one of our most active volunteers." The hospital's overhead speaker crackled with an emergency announcement. Rose apologized. She needed to respond to a trauma case. As she stood to leave, she squeezed Anne's shoulder, a gesture that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. The reporter watched Rose hurry away, then turned back to Anne. "One final question. What would you say to other departments wanting to implement similar changes?" Anne thought about everything she'd learned. Start small, but start somewhere. Build genuine relationships. Listen more than you talk. And remember that every interaction is an opportunity to either reinforce old barriers or build new bridges. Looking around the busy cafeteria, Anne could see the small signs of change they'd helped create. Hospital staff and police officers chatted casually over lunch. Teenagers from their mentoring program volunteered in various departments. Community members felt comfortable approaching officers with concerns or questions. "The most important thing I've learned," Anne concluded, "is that change isn't just about avoiding mistakes. It's about actively creating the kind of community we want to live in. And that takes all of us working together." 1 year to the day after the incident, the community center's main hall was packed for a special event. Banners announcing the Bridge Builders Initiative hung from the walls, and people from all walks of life filled the seats. In the front row, Anne sat next to Dr. Thompson, both of them watching as the mayor approached the podium. "A year ago, the mayor began, our community faced a crisis that could have torn us apart. Instead, thanks to 2 remarkable women, it brought us together in ways we never expected." Anne glanced at the audience. She saw Officer Chen and his mother seated together, both beaming with pride. Captain Richards was there with his daughter Katie, now fully recovered from her brain surgery. Ashley, their young mentee, sat with a group of students wearing Future Doctors t-shirts. The mayor continued, "Today, we're officially launching a program that started as a simple conversation between a police officer and a doctor. The Bridge Builders Initiative will now be implemented across our entire city, bringing together law enforcement, medical professionals, educators, and community members. Dr. Thompson squeezed Anne's hand as they walked to the podium together. Looking out at the crowd, Anne remembered that terrible day a year ago, marveling at how a moment of prejudice had transformed into something so meaningful. "When I made the worst mistake of my career," Anne began, her voice clear and strong, "I had two choices. I could let shame and guilt consume me, or I could learn and grow from it. Thanks to Dr. Thompson's incredible grace and wisdom, I chose the second path." Rose stepped forward. "And when I was wrongfully arrested that day, I also had two choices. I could let anger drive my response, or I could see an opportunity for real change. Looking at all of you today, I know we made the right choice." They presented the program's results from the pilot year. A 60% reduction in bias-related complaints, doubled community participation in police outreach programs, and a new mentorship system that paired police officers with community members. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. Ashley stood up to share her experience. "Last year, I was afraid of police officers," she admitted. "Now, Officer Parker helps me with my science homework, and I'm not scared anymore. I know she sees me as a person, not just, well, you know." The audience nodded, many wiping away tears. They understood exactly what she meant. Anne and Rose unveiled the next phase of their initiative, expanding the youth program to all city schools, creating a regular forum for community police dialogue, and establishing a scholarship fund for minority students interested in law enforcement or medicine. But the real change, Rose emphasized, happens in small moments. It's in the way Officer Parker now greets new residents in Pine Valley. It's in how our police officers volunteer at the hospital. It's in the friendships that have formed across lines that used to divide us. As the formal presentation ended, people mingled around the refreshment tables. Anne watched as police officers chatted with teenagers who used to avoid them. Hospital staff shared stories with community leaders. Children played together, oblivious to the differences that once seemed so important to their parents. "Did you ever imagine this?" Anne asked Rose quietly, looking at what they'd created. "Actually, I did," Rose smiled. "The first time you came to shadow me at the hospital, I saw something in your eyes. A real desire to understand and change. That's all it takes sometimes, just one person willing to do the hard work of transformation." Captain Richards approached them, holding an envelope. "The State Police Academy wants you both to develop a training program based on your work here," he announced proudly. "They think every department in the state could benefit from your experience." As the evening wound down, Anne and Rose stood outside the community center, watching the sunset. A group of kids played basketball nearby, their laughter floating on the evening air. Among them were children of police officers playing alongside children who, just a year ago, would have run at the sight of a patrol car. "You know what the best part is?" Anne said, watching the kids play. "They'll grow up knowing a different reality than we did. They'll know that mistakes don't have to be endings. They can be beginnings." Rose nodded, her eyes on the horizon where the sun painted the sky in brilliant colors. "And they'll know that change is always possible, as long as we're brave enough to choose it." Together, they watched the future they'd helped create unfold before them, knowing that their story would continue to inspire others to build their own bridges across the divides that separate us.